Call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for May 19th, 2020 to order. Good evening, Council and staff and RDG. It is impractical to hold an in-person Ames City Council meeting due to the Governor of Iowa declaring a public health emergency occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Governor placing limits on the size of public gatherings. This meeting is being held electronically as allowed by Section 21.8 of the Iowa Code. And given the fact that tonight's meeting is a workshop, there will not be any public input taken. The meeting can also be viewed live on YouTube, youtube.com/Ames Channel 12, or on cityofames.org/Channel 12, or on Mediacom Channel 12. We have two items on the agenda this evening. The first is a resolution correcting the name of subdivision approved by resolution number 20-245 on May 12th, 2020 from Kingsbury Subdivision 3rd Edition to Kingsbury Subdivision 4th Edition, excuse me. Is there a motion relative to that resolution?
Move the resolution.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any discussion? Moved by Betcher, seconded by Martin. Roll call, please.
Betcher,
Aye.
Garten,
Aye.
Dunk,
Aye.
Corriere,
Aye.
Martin,
Aye.
Edie Hansen.
Aye.
Thank you. All right, moving on to item number 2, the Ames 2040 workshop regarding parks and open space principles and environmental principles. Kelly, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. I hope you can see the presentation up on the screen. Is that working right now?
We can see your screen. Yes, Kelly.
All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about parks and open space as well as the environment. And we're going to address this as kind of two sets of principles. They are at times interrelated. Just as we had discussions about land use and other topics previously, there's always some element of related issues here. That's why it's a comprehensive plan. And I'm going to turn it over to Corey to walk through the beginning of the presentation. And this is Corey Scott from RDG.
Mayor, Council, thanks for having me again. Can we put this in presentation mode?
Is it not in presentation mode on your screen?
It's not in presentation mode.
Okay, hold on a second. So it moved it to my second monitor. Hold on.
Some of the land use elements seem that we went into a lot of detail with that, and now we're getting into some of the other sub elements, and so that's the parks, trails, and open space, and the environment piece. And with everything that we have shown you in the past and where the subsequent pieces will be. Each section will start off with vision, go into principles, and then there's some action items. So for parks, trails, and open space, again, trying to keep it very broad, the vision as coming out of all the public engagement and some of the things that we've been hearing, trying to articulate that. We try to succinct it down to open space and recreation facilities support the physical and well-being of the community. This is something that we can come back to and also continue to refresh as subsequent elements of the chapter start coming out here in the next month or two. Looking back on some of the previous work that was done and building off of it, looking at the existing park types, you'll see a map where we identify the regional, community, neighborhood, the woodlands and open spaces and specialty. And so really building off of the previous plan. And the current plan too will have tighter definitions on all these too, at least how it was identified in the previous plan. And then including service areas as well. And so that essentially is what we're looking at. There, the policy was looking at 10 acres of additional parkland per 1,000 people. So you can imagine, based on the previous approach, it was for every 1,000 people we grow, we will add additional 10 acres of park space.
And Corey, since the presentation we gave out on Friday, I did add a slide with an inventory of each of the parks that will show up here in a couple of different frames before we get to the maps.
Okay. And so just for documentation showing what the goals for the master plan from that the 2013 and 2018, now according to the 2018, it's now 2020. So a suggestion for updating that would be one of the things coming out as an action item. And again, building off of all the previous planning efforts and doing some quotes from some of the things that we heard from the survey responses, got a number of them there. Even from the first meetings that we had way back in the spring of 2019, got a lot of input as far as what people like and what they would like to see changed. Had a number of exhibits with that. And then also even talked about it during our design studios as well when we were looking at forecasting for 2040. And so some of the things that people said, they wanted to be walkable. So that was very popular. And so thinking about that and how that translates into some of the principles and actions you'll see. Walkability, healthy lifestyle. These are all things that really rose to the top. And so they're pulled into this chapter and some of the exhibits that we have.
So this was we're not going to go through this, but if you have a question about some of the specific parks, this is out of the Parks and Rec brochure, describes the size and features and year of creation for the parks. I think the question, we have about 20 neighborhood parks, six community parks, a handful of specialized parks, and we have 8 at Hayden as a regional park, just to give you some context of what you have as resources in the city.
And this is just a quick snapshot of what that looks like. Clearly, when you look on this online, it'll be something that you can zoom in, zoom out of, or if you're on Google Maps, you can see that too. And then when we took a look at that, and we looked at the paper cup method, which is kind of looking at a quarter-mile buffer, and so that's thinking about access and walkability to these parks. The one thing about the paper cup method that it doesn't account for is just some of these natural barriers that happen. So that could be a stream, that could be a major roadway. And so while the paper cup method shows a broader area, there's actually Lincoln Way could actually be a barrier from people feeling like they could easily cross from their neighborhood, cross Lincoln Way to get to a park, for example. Then adding into what the existing greenways is. Again, these are just areas that are natural features, drainage areas, and kind of a little bit of a buffer around each one of them that is generally undeveloped at the moment. So this is actually kind of creating a structure for the entire plan itself too, because the system of greenways and interconnectivity and connection with nature. So looking at these when we were looking at all the development concepts and trying to how to integrate development and environment together. Then if you overlay the active transportation systems, so this is going to be your your streets. These show like how sometimes the greenways and the parks and how the complete streets help complete the entire system that you have right now. Still some gaps, but some opportunities for 2040. So when looking at all those past plans and the public input and some feedback that we've been hearing from past council meetings, we essentially created, I think it was 8 or 9 different principles. So with that, what I'll do is I'll go through the first page, take a pause if we want to revisit any of these, if you have questions. These are completely subject to wordsmithing, and again, if we want to add more principles or if we want to retract or revisit the language, that's something that we can do very easy. So the first one is reflect community values with public space for social and physical well-being that private open space alone cannot accomplish. A little supporting narrative, the city of Ames parks and open spaces are a jewel of the community and point of pride that brings people together from across the community. Second one, accessible and desired open space opportunities provide for parks and open space with walkable distances for homes in addition to large-scale community park facilities. And then, of course, 3, concurrent growth of parkland with development. Expansion of the city will require provision of new neighborhood parks as well as larger community parks. Population increase with the city within the city will also create needs for additional facilities or increase use of existing facilities. So as the city grows, so grows our park system. Maintain and expand the system of parks and types to meet varied needs of the community overall. Some supporting narrative is incorporating needed facilities into existing parks, as well as into newly designed parks. Parks and trails will be designed to ensure that spaces are safe, enjoyable, fun, and distinct. And so neighborhoods go in cycles, and so the users of parks actually change. And so it's just a system of making sure that we know the people that this park is servicing and then consider adapting the parks to service those users. So that's the first of this page. There's going to be some that are going to be on the next page, but happy to take any comments and discussion on this one.
Questions, council?
Oh, Corey, as you're presenting these to us, how should we be thinking about the relationship between public space, private space, and university or state space? I see the public and the private, but I'm not sure how to factor in our understanding of what the university's available space does for us in our calculations or our determination of need for facilities.
Gloria, I can answer a little bit of that. We did not inventory ISU land or private open space in discussing the inventory of parkland in the city. So on that earlier slide where we said we had about 18 acres of land per 1,000 people, that is strictly city controlled or city leased land, such as Brookside, parts of Brookside. So we have not taken any effort to rely on other people to meet the open space needs in this plan at this point.
Oh, so then we maybe are sort of assuming that university and private are kind of synonymous with each other, that it's something that's not city controlled.
Difference for me would be under the final principle we have, which is support partnerships. There's clearly times where the city and ISU have formal relationships that are of benefit to everybody in the city, which is quite a bit different than private. We might have formal leases. We might just have partnerships to promote different things. I think private space is quite a bit different than ISU space.
Well, the reason I ask is because in looking at the bubbles with the 1/4 mile radius, there are clearly spaces that are gaps, but a lot of those are gaps that are created by the fact that we have ISU open space. For example, over in the South Campus area, other than the bubble on, I suppose that's Campus Town Court near Greenway, it looks like it's really hard to get to open space. but it's not, because people walk on the cross-country course, they walk in the arboretum, they walk around the athletic complex, they play with their dogs in these areas. So they're treating that university land as parkland, even though it is not strictly speaking designated for that use. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out how we think about that sort of public property that is serving the purpose of a park, but isn't really a park.
Well, I think,
Maybe that's not important.
I think it might be a detail that gets kicked down the road to the master plan process. I think we're trying to establish high-level policies about park needs, individual analysis of neighborhoods and the features they desire or can support. I think is more of a master plan level discussion. And I think that'd be a great place to kind of look at, well, maybe walking resources aren't really a necessity because of what you brought up for different ISU properties that are there. It's more that a playground is needed or something in an area where walking is already abundant. So just having an area doesn't always answer the question. I think the master plan is probably the better resource.
Okay, thank you.
Other question?
I had a question. The principal page, to what degree is this tailored for our community? It seems like, this could be used in many different communities. Are there aspects of this that are unique to Ames?
Well, these were written fresh, but I could see where it could be used for a number of different communities, because I think a lot of communities are facing the same things, particularly when they're thinking about the next 20 years and just coming up with some best practices. But yeah, this is unique to Ames.
The other thing I would say, Tim, is that a lot of people look at let me get the name wrong, the NRPA. Corey, what does that stand for again?
National Recreation Parks Association.
So a lot of people look at that organization as a professional resource and draw similar conclusions about well-being, park sizes, park ratios, things you would want to address in a planning document. So I think it's very common for someone to probably at a high level have very similar policies to these. I think the unique part to Ames, and it's probably not unique, it's probably fairly common, but what's really practical for us is these different sizes of parks, and to think about that we're willing to have interventions into areas at different scales to make sure we have resources for people to utilize. Otherwise, I would agree, a lot of this is very similar. Most people are going to want this as part of their community.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I do have a question about I guess the shape of the evening. Am I right in thinking that basically what we're doing is walking through an early draft of a chapter or chapters in the draft comprehensive plan, and our mission tonight is really to sort of advise that we would like to move forward with what has been presented and suggest maybe some changes, that sort of thing?
That's very fair, Dave. So essentially what we need is some buy-in, because as we start advancing some of the chapter, we start writing about things and we go down a path that to pivot it can be done, but it eats up time that otherwise could be being put towards something that you really wanted.
But I think David's question is a really good question, and I had the same one. So is this a document that's really more descriptive of how we view our parks today, or is it meant to be a document that serves a prescriptive purpose, helping us think through what our vision is in the future? And I think those are two very different things. And my personal hope, and we'll see if the council has an interest, I would like to make our park system better. So this isn't about just doing status quo, such that this would be just a descriptive document. I hope we can have a robust discussion about ways in which we can take our parks to another level.
Totally agree. Yeah, and Kelly's going to go through some of those action items too to see how we can realize some of these visions on the ground.
So, and just following up on my question then, so as we go through this, this is the first slide with, I guess, a lot of text on it. Are we sort of imagining that that these principles will then be fleshed out even further in the comprehensive plan, or is this sort of the level at which we expect this part to be drafted?
This is about the level to which it'll be drafted.
Okay.
We can get into a lot more details if that's something that you give us direction on. It starts to paint the corners a little bit tighter for you, but here, kind of keeping the principles broad provides some interpretation yet.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
David, though, when we get to the next section with the actions, those are much more specific in some cases.
Yeah.
Those would also make it into the plan. So it's a combination of setting a framework and a vision for activities or actions that might happen over 20 years, but some of them are trying to be prescriptive to get us on the course to reach these principles.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
Other questions? I have one question. That is an item on both principle 3 and 4 talks about expanding and or making larger community parks within the existing park system. And also in item 4 talks about incorporate these facilities into existing parks. Can you kind of comment on that in terms of how would larger community parks be accomplished within the existing city limits?
Right.
Well, I think, Mr. Mayor, I think you're reading the word larger different than when I looked at that sentence. So we were really using larger as a descriptor of community parks, not necessarily that we need to enlarge Brookside Park or those larger scale parks when they're surrounded by development. So I think if that's what you thought we meant, is that we need to acquire internal parkland around those large parks, that wasn't exactly what we were going for there.
I have a related question about how you categorize parks, like neighborhood versus community. You showed a good infographic there with a bunch of symbols earlier in the presentation. It was like page 4 or something. But I don't see that online, and I kind of just looked on the park's website. I didn't see that either. Is that something we can access? Because that was.
It is. It's in the. I had to get that today from Parks and Rec. It's in the brochure, the Parks and Rec program they put out. It's in that document. So I didn't know it was there. I did find it. It's probably it's something that we'll include in the posted version of this.
It's a brochure.
It's so when you want to sign up for classes through Parks and Rec,
I see.
that PDF document or that print document has the map of the city.
Yeah.
To that table that I showed you tonight.
Okay. Could you? Would you be able to email a link or have?
Yeah.
So one thing that I'll just mention, Bronwyn, in regards to that, one of the things that we've been doing is working with GIS, Ben McConville, and what we're trying to do is actually getting an interactive map of our park system. So you can take a look at the city of Ames. You can click on Brookside Park and then start pulling up, pictures of playgrounds, pictures of shelters, and make it more interactive. That is something that we're working on, but in the meantime, we can definitely get this put onto our website so people can access it.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think it's not exactly related, so I won't take a lot of time with it, but I've had some people in the Roosevelt neighborhood ask about how a park's designation gets chosen. So if Roosevelt might be at some point considered a community rather than neighborhood park.
Yeah, and I can
come back to, if I can come back to your question in a second, Bronwyn, I wanted to answer to the mayor's comments on 3 and 4.
Oh, sorry, sure.
So in 3, when I said that we weren't necessarily looking at expanding the existing community parks necessarily, what we were really saying in 3 is that more community parks will be needed that are larger than neighborhood parks. That's what I was trying to say there. But we've also talked about that in the existing areas, there are service gaps. You can see that on those maps, and we want to take opportunities if they present themselves to look at that opportunity for more parkland. But we also might have to change features in parks. to meet needs that evolve over the next 20 years. So it's at every level about working with what we have, getting more of what we need, and then also expanding all of those resources as we grow the city.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I think it might just be some wordsmithing a little bit on those to just be a little clearer. And the same question comes to item 4, says maintain and expand the system of park types. Is that in the, is that also, and I think that you can find council and we're all very supportive of the park system. I think it's a really important quality of life issue. So it's just trying to understand. So we're really clear for this council and also future councils, what are the principles that are being adopted so that there's no question, or we have some goals, or when we do CIPs, we know that it's consistent with the principles that we're adopting. That's primarily the reason for the question. So.
Sure. So I want to just jump back here.
Oh.
This bulleted list here, this is really the kind of the working definitions that are in the LUPP now, and they're also in the parks master plan. And it describes the kind of the parameters of what those are. Neighborhoods park generally being smaller, not having parking lots, having a kind of a set of facilities that are consistent across the city. They might vary somewhat, but some basic expectations. Community parks are much larger, intended to draw people from a much greater distance. I think they're in that 1 to 2 mile service range. So not everybody's going to walk that comes there. And they're going to have unique features or have large facilities that support a larger population. So we want to go ahead with that kind of concept, that we're really breaking these things down into different pieces, and we can work on programming those. Parks and Rec can be consistent in their expectations, and developers can kind of understand what we're looking for by saying that we're looking at a neighborhood park. In some areas we might need community parks, and that needs to be something we have to talk about and show probably on future maps. Specialty parks are something I think we need to work with more. For example, when Gloria pointed out, well, there's a service radius around Campus Town Square and Campus Town. Well, that's a very, very small park, and it's probably worth calling that a specialty park rather than a neighborhood park. So eventually we'll sort these out a little bit different, but we want to use the same system where what the type of park is doesn't matter to where it's at.
Will these be defined in the final document?
They are in the current LUPP, so we were probably going to bring most of that forward.
I think it's nice to have that in one location. So kind of one of the questions I had when you're starting up is just, what do those mean? I think just so we have the same context, that'd be very helpful, I think.
Okay, so that was probably what we were going to do, and we can definitely move that ahead.
Great, thank you.
Context, yeah.
Kelly, so let me just go back to the comment about Campus Town Court before we lose it. If that is considered some sort of specialty park, would then a plaza that we might develop downtown also be under the heading of park?
I think it would. I think it would fall under specialty. We have a little bit later on when we talked about the actions, we talked a little bit about maybe plazas in core areas being public or private, recognizing they're not necessarily green space, but they are community space possibly, or for social or commercial activities. So it's probably a category that we need to evolve a little bit and probably be recognized that the plazas are maybe different than green space. That's what I would advocate for.
Thanks.
Okay, ready to move on to principles 5 through 8, unless someone else has a question.
Bronwyn, did we get through your question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the mayor's question either. I was just thinking if they did move in type from, say, neighborhood to community, it might be a type of expansion. But I can see how, like a parking lot being required or being able to draw from a large area, certainly you couldn't change any old neighborhood park to a community park very easily. So I now I see that maybe would be very rare that we'd have the opportunity to take like a Roosevelt, say, with a neighborhood designation and somehow morph that. But yeah, no, that totally does answer my question. I'll poke around some more on the city's website for that thing you're showing right there too.
Yeah, I think this table helps to understand there's a big jump in most cases from neighborhood to community park. Van shell might be unique because of the street parking that's around it and some of the other stuff that's there. But for the most part, neighborhood parks are pretty tight to the land resource.
Yeah, thank you.
So, okay, so we're going to move on to principles 5, 6,
Yes.
Corey.
Okay. Plan a system of interconnected greenways. Again, thinking about parks, trails, and open spaces. A system of greenways should preserve environmentally sensitive areas while offering opportunities for connecting people to the outdoors, including pathways and water trails. Recognize that parks and greenway trails can be a vital part of the transportation system. So some of the thinking behind this is that pathways need to go somewhere. There are going to be barriers, and where there are barriers, using the transportation system to supplement some of those gaps. Number 6, stewardship and variety of open space. Public open space can provide for recreation as well as natural and environmentally sensitive area preservation. The city's planning will account for needed passive area experience as well as active recreation. Some facilities may serve a dual purpose and offer opportunities to enhance the natural environment with flood control, stormwater management, water quality, and reestablishment of habitat. So, for example, some communities use recreation fields in low-lying areas that can help also at times manage stormwater. Perhaps more in Minnesota and Wisconsin, some of the low-lying areas are used for ice skating and so forth, and hockey. Fiscally responsible, the parks and trail system have substantial ongoing operation costs with limited resources that require planning, budgets, and programming to maintain and the quality of new and existing facilities and recognition of available funding resources. And so this is also kind of a bit of counting the costs. We can build these parks, but how are we going to maintain it? And then finally, support partnerships. Ames will welcome partnerships to provide diversity of recreation, natural features, and locations in the parks and trail system. The county park facilities near the community in the French area are a valuable resource to Ames in the county. And so in the city, you can imagine Gloria, Iowa State University providing some of this. That is a partnership. And then on the French areas and some of our growth areas, thinking about collaboration with Story County. So that is some of the thinking going into each one of these.
I have a question about this set too, and it's about the greenways. So I love it. I like the interconnected pathways. The water trails is the part I'm curious about. I was going to mention just in general that I think the rivers are an underutilized resource in Ames, and so I do really want to see us focus in this section on how we can, better emphasize the waterways, so both as recreational, but also, I mean, in a really, I don't know if it could be done, but you could almost use them for transportation, perhaps, way down the road, in a future-looking way. Anyway, that's my question is, how can we emphasize the water part of that equation and not just trails on dry ground near water? Right.
Bronwyn, when you say, I think it's a great point. When you say waterways, does that mean just the water itself, or also include area on both sides that would be contiguous with the waterway? So path development or other opportunities? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say both. So, I love the thought of being able to have like a trail that would go along the river, say. Mm-hmm. But also, I don't want to lose sight of maybe the opportunity to think about the river itself as a pathway. There are some more challenges with that. Depends a lot on weather and access to the river in order to use the river as a transportation path. But it is quite interesting, if you got in a kayak at Brookside, you could get all the way down to South 16th. It's an interesting thing we don't use much. But no, I like the idea of trails along the river too, for like walking or biking or whatever.
Did you have other questions on this, on 5 through 8?
No.
Anybody else have questions or comments on 5 through 8? I do have a couple of questions. Can you define a greenway for us? What does that mean?
Yeah, generally a larger open space that's more in a natural state. And so sometimes greenways can actually be along street corridors. For some of you who might be familiar with the Des Moines area, MLK, Martin Luther King Parkway, definitely has some greenway aspects. And so there's a trail, there's a sense of open space there, and that connects one trail to another trail. And so that is just one other exhibit of what can be done. So again, there's going to be some gaps in the system, and using our existing transportation system to help connect that. But greenways generally areas that are undeveloped and open.
So is that why it ties into, in the very end of point 5, a vital part of the transportation system? So would that be vehicular, pedestrian? Would that be bicycle, or what would that be? And is that tied in with our transportation plan that we're updating also?
Complete streets, yeah, complete streets. It's essentially what that is right now.
I think for the way we're thinking of it right now, I think it's non-vehicular connections. The LRTP, I think the last one, the 2040 mobility plan, did bring up trails and pathway connections and had shined a little more light on that. We don't want to lose track of that, so we want to make sure the comprehensive plan is that link between recreation and transportation, and don't just rely on the federal planning process to try and remember to bring that up. And not all greenways will have paths in them. There will be a map that'll be similar to the slide that we showed earlier that tries to depict these natural areas that we think are more likely to be greenways, whether they're public or private. So that'll be fleshed out a little bit more in the chapter, but it's mostly about non-vehicular travel in the ways we've been thinking.
Okay, thank you. And also the concept of the term environmentally sensitive areas comes up quite a bit, in our in this document as we go through it. So in the areas where we're talking about growing, are there environmentally sensitive areas that we're going to be identifying needing to be preserved that would be consistent with point or principle 5 and principle 6, and also it'll be brought up later on in the presentation?
Yeah.
Here's my thinking is that will people who are purchasing property understand that the city views those as being environmentally sensitive, and as such, there's an expectation if we adopt these principles that those areas are going to be preserved and protected. See where I'm going with this? It's trying to understand, for clarity's sake, we can adopt a principle. We want to make sure that everyone understands what we're expecting moving forward.
Mr. Mayor, I think.
Yeah, and so going through that.
I think we're following a lot about how the current LUPP is written and developed. If someone is looking at land to annex and develop in the city, and if you go to the city's planning documents, you can find identification of where habitat resources have been identified, where the floodplain is, other attributes that might be sensitive to intrusion. And the developer should also be aware of they can't fill wetlands and some of those other more normal permitting processes. So we're really trying to continue what's in the LUPP now. It's going to rely on maps, and it's going to rely on the planning staff when annexation applications come in to identify what might be an issue for someone as they look to come into the city. And as we do development, we focus more and more on the specifics. At the high level of annexation, we're identifying, oh, there's a riparian corridor here, or there's known wetlands here. Developer will have to do. And then at zoning, we get more detail, subdivision, and so on, to where we get really site-specific studies. So I think as long as the policies are here, we bring forward maps and other resources that lets the planning staff communicate to the development community and to property owners, it's not just developers, about what expectations would be.
Thank you.
Add on to that. So the nice thing is that you've already seen that map. And so that future land use map. So in this chapter, essentially what we do is we extract all the other land use elements from it, and we just isolate just the greenways, the parks, and that element. And so essentially you've already seen that map, but what we've done is we pulled away all the other land uses, and you can just see that so it can top from the map itself. So that's the nice thing, that we know where those are already at.
So I have one additional question. In Principle 6, where we're talking about needed passive area experiences, are we talking about those areas like plazas where people may just go to enjoy themselves, to be in that space? That's a kind of placemaking element? Or is there some other meaning there that you're intending?
I kind of probably defer a little bit to Keith, but I would say passive areas are areas where you're not intensively programming the space. It's going to be more open and more flexible. Either you're having a picnic on the grass, or you're just kicking the hacky sack around, or if they do that anymore. But so whereas active recreation is going to be a little bit more programmed.
So is Ada Hayden a good example of a passive area or portions of it?
Yes. And that's what I was gonna, reference is that's how Ada Hayden was really set up. Yeah, there's walking, there's jogging, there's, different things, there's fishing, but it's really more of a passive. You don't see we get requests, hey, can you put soccer fields out there? Can you put playgrounds? Can you put a lot of other things? And that really wasn't the setup of that. It was to be more passive, and that's where we're trying to keep it. So that's a good example.
I think you could think of Inez Grove at a different scale, where parts of it are clearly programmed for recreation and others are not as much. I think the larger your park systems are, or larger individual parks, you'll have little elements of each. But the main point is that not everything is going to be a programmed active recreation space in the park system.
And on item 6, when it talks about reestablishment of habitat, what does that mean? Is that wildlife? Is that vegetation? And is that within a park itself, or what's included in that?
It could be. I think Ada Hayden's another great example of that, where we have a lot of management plans with the Oak Savannah and the other things that we've done to reestablish prairie and different things that weren't there when it was a quarry.
And wildlife, yep.
Yeah, so it could be any of those kind of things. And again, it's not going to be every park, but some of them are going to be well suited to that.
I just have a comment. I really appreciate point 8 being brought in there. I just think that to think beyond just our city borders and to look for partnerships, working with the county in terms of intentionally planning and coordinating, long-term visions and development, either with the trail system, bike trail or whatever, is a great piece. And I think it broadens the overall scale and vision of, quality of life opportunities in Ames. So I really was thrilled to see that in there. Any other questions on principles 5 through 8 for staff before we move on to the next page? Okay, let's move on.
So this slide was in the presentation, but we moved it up here. This was, again, to give kind of that full picture that we've been talking about. We've been really focused on the growth areas, which are the circles, but you can start to see where Greenways overlay with the developable areas. You see ISU land, which in some cases may or may not be available for recreation or open space. But this is kind of that framework you start to see with greenways, parks, and then development layered in together. So try and keep this in your mind when you're starting to think about the policies and how these will all come together at one time in the future. So from the broad level principles, we're trying to get to actions or policies that would apply to either city actions or in many cases to how we would look at a development proposal. One of the key ones is to plan for the amount of land that we need to meet our expected ratios. We talked about this a little bit. We're going to need more than one community park if we're going to grow in multiple directions. So it's one thing to say we need a certain amount of land for 15,000 people. But when you start to think about how accessible is a park, we'll probably have to think over the next 20 years about, does it mean we need a community park in the west and the south? Or are there going to be a more heavy influence of growth in one direction. So we only really need one now, but plan for a second one maybe in the next horizon of the comp plan. But we need to be able to plan for these larger park areas so we can respond to the growth that happens throughout the community. And what we're proposing to bring forward from the current land use plan is the idea that we really want to secure 10 acres of open space and parks in total per 1,000 people. And we want to focus on the 5 acres of developable active park space as something that we're looking for from the development community as they move into these growth areas, and we need to have resources to serve the future citizens of Ames. The open space would supplement that, but in a lot of cases, it's not going to replace the need for developable parkland. And as we note here in item D, really we think the Parks Master Plan is the right document to talk about the needed improvements and facilities, both in existing areas as well as in some cases the expanded areas of the city.
Kelly, can I ask for a little bit of clarification on B, 1B? You, when you were speaking, said 10 acres per 1,000 people, which is what we saw on a previous slide. But here we've got 18 acres per 1,000 people. Is that just a typo, or is it actually supposed to be 18?
No, so we're trying to hold this at 2 levels. I think the city, I think what we're putting out there, the city should aspire to have park resources similar to what it has today. And that's that ratio of 18 per 1,000. But something like Ada Hayden isn't brought about by a development project. That's a city initiative. So we don't necessarily have those kinds of scale projects identified or baked into this exactly. But we don't want to lose track of that, because if we didn't do Ada Hayden in the last 20 years, we wouldn't be at 18 acres per 1,000. It's almost a third of our total park. So that we have the really high number for maybe larger significant park projects. But when we talk about the day-to-day park needs, that's where the dedication of 5 acres per 1,000 for developable land and the 5 acres for open space are more meaningful on the development level. Does that help distinguish the two, but still have value for both?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Kelly, can you walk through, so when we start getting our the land use maps, how does it work when you want a larger park? A developer comes in, let's say he's buying 160 acres, or he wants to bring in a certain tract of land. Do you have a conversation with them early on saying we want some of that land dedicated for park? Or can you just walk us through, or at least help me understand what process we go through? Or do we just target specific areas that we want to pick up because they're environmentally sensitive or have opportunities to connect with other park systems?
So my experience in the past 6 years is it's been a little hit or miss. We don't have, because the LUPP is so old. For example, we changed directions and said we were going to go north. We didn't identify really park resources for the north. We did identify park resources for the southwest. So it's been a little bit hit or miss on how we saw annexation requests and zoning requests to really have a formula to say this is what we should be asking for, looking for. So when Rose Prairie came in, they didn't originally have land for a public park. When they came in to rezone the site and asked for more density, we stepped back and said, hey, there's really way more housing out here than what was first thought of. We need to plan for a neighborhood park. So we negotiated that into a development agreement. But that wasn't the first thing that was done. So this kind of new updated document will help staff be more aware of what are the needed resources and bring that forward early on in conversations.
So will there be a vision developed in concert with Parks and Recreation Commission, parks staff, RDG, planning, to kind of pinpoint where some areas where parks might be considered or proposed to be put in, or is that just premature and just too theoretical?
I think it's a little bit too precise.
Okay.
So if I go back to this map, we knew in the west that we needed park area. So when RDG did the land use diagrams for the scenarios, they left some green areas. We added green areas in to represent that we knew we needed parkland. That does not mean that shape right there in the West Ames has to be a community park. It's really there to make sure we don't lose track of that and start to look at the subdivision options in that area. So there's a few of those will be shown in the land use map, along with the greenways. And I think we've tried to say, and for the most part, greenways combined with a neighborhood park, with a community park might be the most advantageous way to go, but we don't know that for sure at this point.
Also, Kelly, and in there, I think one of the things that on 1D, when it talks about the park master plan, I think that's where, recreation, parks and recreation staff, the Parks and Recreation Commission, and most likely the consent, we'll look and see where are there areas. Once we get this information and we get that higher level thought process in the comprehensive plan, then we'll take that information, and I think that's when we'll start digging down a little bit deeper and try to start identifying, where are those possible areas that we could do a community park, a neighborhood park, and look at trying to identify some of the land that may be available to accomplish those goals.
Well, just not, thank you, Keith, not knowing what size pieces of land will come in, but if it just starts coming in piecemeal, and in smaller, in smaller chunks, just trying to think how does it, who makes the decision? How do you get direction? Who as a property owner needs to dedicate land to accomplish our objectives? That was all. Just but I'm going to trust that that's what you worked through with staff. Is that right? And the overall vision for that area.
That'll segue a little bit here to number 2.
Okay.
Number 2 is trying to be a little bit more the nitty gritty of it.
Okay.
So your question was, well, how do we identify this and deal with development right now? We don't have a parkland dedication ordinance, so it really is incumbent upon the city to negotiate early on in an annexation or a rezoning process to identify the need for public parkland. What we're saying is, and this isn't uncommon in Iowa, it's definitely not uncommon in the country, to be a little more rigorous about this and have an ordinance that would be more prescriptive about what we expect developments to contribute towards park resources. So it doesn't get stuck all on one development saying, oh, you're the last one in, we didn't get a park for the last 10 years, we need a big chunk of your land. So if we go this route, we either can try to continue to do it through the annexation and rezoning process, or we can make it more predictable and go through a parkland dedication ordinance.
Okay.
And there'll be times where there won't be a big enough project to really secure usable land. So MUP is okay in that circumstance, but it will help us plan to at least get neighborhood-sized parks into development. It isn't going to answer the question for community parks, probably. That's going to have to be a separate level of analysis, as Keith was bringing up. That when we know what we need in a community park, we probably have to identify the land that's available for it and look at negotiating for it, or really plan for that separately from neighborhood development.
And just to jump in, I hope this is clear to everyone. When we ask a developer to dedicate a chunk of that land to the city for a park, that doesn't just miraculously come from the sky. They're paying a certain amount per acre for that land. And so then in order for their business model to work, then that just shifts the costs of the development to the remaining lots. So in essence, we're squeezing the developer for a public good. And at some point, depending on the size of the park, that becomes a taking. So we say, look, you just can't have this development unless you give us this extraordinary piece of land. And we need as a community to say, this is a value for the entire community, and we should ask the entire community to pay for that land. And because otherwise, recognize this just gets pushed out and it drives the cost per lot up on the remaining lots higher. Just want to make sure everyone's clear on that.
So Tim, I think I would break that into two different levels. The neighborhood parks are really being driven by the development of the neighborhood. The community parks are clearly of community value, much broader appeal and service area. And it's probably not proportional to request community parks, at least all of a community park from a development. And this is one reason I'd advocate for the ordinance up front, is when a developer looks to buy land, they can put that in their pro forma, understanding that there's a certain amount of park dedication expected. And they should be bidding for that land based on what they can get out of it, rather than buy the land, come to the city and go, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had to do that. I'm 20 houses short on my pro forma. I think that's the best reason to go for an ordinance in the future, is to make it predictable and developers can account for the cost. Or really not the cost, the lack of potential revenue from that land. We have in the past taken on the development cost of the park itself. We've really only asked for land dedication, and usable land is really the expectation here. And the city has come back and provided the park. So really it is funded by the city in the long run. It's just reserving that land for city and neighborhood beneficial use.
I think it's very appropriate. I think the Rose Prairie example is a good example of where there was some disconnect as far as expectations. So I think your comments are very appropriate. Thank you.
And I'll point out here that the current LUPP really relies a lot on private open space as a feature of the development, in a way to augment the public. So we don't necessarily have dedicated public land out of all of our developments in the suburban village areas, but we do have a lot of private open space, and we think we would carry forward some of that expectation. It's been pretty popular. Developers have been able to work that into their systems. If they dedicate land for public purpose, then they should be relieved of that private open space. So we're not double dipping on that. That's something that we would want to work with as we go forward as well. We're not trying to double dip on the amount of land. We want to just make sure it's the right kind of land in the right place, whether it's public or private. Is there any questions on the concept of, and I'm not committing to this dedication ordinance now. I think this is one of those, it's an action step where when the new comp plan's completed and we're kind of auditing what needs to change in the city's codes to fulfill the visions in here, this is one of those things that we would have to take on as a subsequent measure, develop what the population estimates are, what's a fair value for land to assign to dedication. We have to do this in the right way. As Tim said, if you go too far, it's a taking. So we need to make sure this is a very organized and has a very solid structure as an ordinance to do it right.
So Kelly, to Tim's point, with item 2D, how would that work in terms of set aside natural areas as passive open space, i.e. all of a sudden would the developer know ahead of time that when he's buying that property, there's going to be natural areas that are going to have to be set aside that would not be developable? Or how does that work? So that I think your whole goal is make sure that the better we can communicate, either via code or ordinance, in an ordinance meeting, then they would know going into it what they're going to have to dedicate and be aware of.
I think that, yeah, we'll have some maps to help guide this. A lot of it's going to be based on site survey. So we might identify a greenway and show a curvy line across the property. That may or may not be, let's say, the true coverage of the tree canopy of the woodland there. So when we get into the subdivision stage, usually we're talking about how much intrusion or reduction in that natural resource is permissible, not whether the resource is there at all. So right now we really defer to a study level and decide it on a project by project basis, and we can keep doing that, or we could establish more prescriptive ordinances up front that just essentially say things are untouchable. That's something we don't have to decide here. I think this policy is trying to set up that we want to make sure we accommodate it one way or the other. And the maps themselves that show the greenways and the natural areas are what would be the identifier up front for property owners.
So this is not a park situation, but recently out there on South 16th, close to Dayton Road,
Yeah.
I think there was an environmental study that was done that showed that there were some valuable, or there's some woodlands there that was supposed to be set aside, and the people that are developing the property did that. Was that part of, how did that come about, just by way of practical example?
Yeah, so that's actually relatively new. So it was about 3 or 4 years ago. It's been in the land use policy plan for a very long time. They should have an environmentally sensitive overlay. We did not apply it as a zoning tool until roughly 2015-16. And in that tool, we mapped the 100-year floodplain and said you should not expect to do development in that area, not the 100-year floodplain, I'm sorry, the floodway, without first doing a biological assessment and in this analyzing what's really the resources there, because it's going to vary. Not every floodplain has the same resources in it. So the product of that study was there's some small wetlands that can be accommodated, but then these oaks were heritage oaks and they should really be preserved. So we didn't have a mandatory thou shalt preserve the trees, but the outcome of the study was it would make sense to preserve these in environmentally sensitive areas. So it's a relatively new process that we applied on that project. And it was really the product of a development review because we had an overlay that said a study was necessary.
Kelly, tell me if this is the right place to bring this up, but on the subject of environmental overlays, I think, isn't the jury still out yet as far as whether these are working? I mean, what we've done around on the north side of Ada Hayden, I still think of this as an experiment in process. We don't yet know if neighbors are going to be compliant with restrictive covenants to protect the watershed. So I want to throw this out there. I want to be really careful that how much weight we put on these, because we haven't fully understood the level of compliance that people will have when there's development around those areas. Is that fair?
I think, I think we're fairly hands-off as a city because we don't have necessarily ongoing city ordinances for maintenance of open space, or we'll generally put it in an easement, but we really leave it up to the HOA to manage a lot of the attributes of that. That is true. We don't have a citywide tree removal ordinance that requires you to get a permit or anything like that. So it is relying on the future homeowners and the future property owners to follow the rules that were expected. I think it works most of the time. I think we can all point at examples where maybe we didn't get the exact outcome we expected, but it's the level of tool that Ames has endorsed up till now.
Yeah, I'll be happy when we get some longitudinal data on water quality in the Ada Hayden watershed to be able to verify that people really followed through. I'm just nervous about it. I'd like to get a little more time under my belt. This may not be the appropriate place to talk about that, but as we think about environmental overlays, which is what I'm talking about, as we think about development, I'm just cautious right now about those. I like the idea. I'm just not convinced that they're working yet. I'd like to be able to know that.
Yeah,
Okay. Ready to move on to item 3? Next slide.
So this is, we talked about this a little bit during the principles. We really want to organize around a system of parks that identifies them as specific types of features. But we want to make sure that when we're defining the resources that we have kind of a basic set of expectations. This is where we're talking about that a neighborhood park has similar features across the city so that we have an equitable park system where people have availability of similar resources. At the same time, not everything's going to be all the same. And if you start to pull back from the layer of the neighborhood, there are opportunities to do somewhat unique things in each one. So they might be an attraction to people from the community on maybe on an annual basis, maybe not every day of the week. But, you know, I haven't been to the west side of Ames. What are the parks like over there? Should I drive across town to visit that? I think if we have a perspective that we want to add something that broadens the appeal beyond the walking neighborhood, it gives a chance for more social interactions, more pride in the overall system, that there's something interesting and unique to do in the city. It's not the same everywhere. So this policy is really trying to put a lot into that. And the Parks Master Plan will be the one that carries out that vision. But we're really trying to set up a vision that there's equity in the park system, but also unique appeal that makes it interesting to the community overall. And C and D are kind of that programming that we've talked about. The threshold that the Parks and Rec has talked about is using more of a 10-minute walk metric. And we've in the past used this quarter mile to a half mile. A 10-minute walk is something you can do in a quarter to a half mile. Pretty common to think that you can walk a mile in 20 minutes. So the quarter mile proximity standard works pretty well. The 10 minutes is a good operational standard to think about as well. And that helps us, again, plan for park service areas and gaps that might come about in the future. And then we talk about specialty parks. I think as we start to urbanize a little bit more, we start to think about plazas or our commercial areas, a destination for social experiences as well, they can be. So thinking of that as a specialty park is probably something new to the plan that's not really in the current land use policy plan. Any questions or thoughts about those attributes?
I have just a couple of things on this one. I have mentioned in the past this idea of trying to find a park space that would be a good location for some outdoor fitness equipment. There are people in our community that can't afford gym fees, and we've got 3 seasons a year where people have access to our parks pretty regularly, and there are companies that makes very good all year, very good sturdy equipment that can be used year round. Keith, I've forwarded those to you in the past. Maybe this is a good time to think about whether that would be something we want to consider in a park that's more centrally located. So that was an idea I wanted to float.
Isn't that a granular or a next level down that would fit into the CIP or the Parks Master Plan versus in the comp plan? I'm just curious which. We'll have 2 tools. Maybe Keith and Kelly can comment on that.
I would agree, Mayor, and we have had conversations, and just even in the last several months, we've been trying to hook up with some manufacturers and some other things in regards to how can we make things happen within the park system. But I would agree. I think it's more of a budgetary concept right now. Is that we could look at it for CIP and include it in our 5-year plan to get some of those things accomplished within the park system.
But how it would, in fairness, how do they ever get into a CIP unless we, at this level, create the policy? I'm not suggesting where it would go in a CIP. I want to defer that level to staff. But from a council perspective, I thought this document was supposed to create vision, and so we're referencing things like disc golf and splash pads. It seems like the idea of creating an outdoor exercise area would be comparable in nature to those items.
I mean, we could definitely add it to that bullet. That's not trying to prioritize one thing over another. It was trying to give examples of things you see in parks. But we're not trying to say that the city needs a second disc golf course. We're just trying to list things. It'd be fine to add would you describe it as, Tim, an outdoor fitness trail?
Oh, yeah, outdoor fitness equipment.
Well, actually, your first bullet, parks and open spaces are neighborhood and community destinations that should be safe, family friendly. You could even add in there, offer a variety of exercise opportunities or something like that. That would actually capture that, I think. And it says, and support strong social networks. Was that adequate, Tim, to accomplish your objective in terms of that?
It certainly is, and I think we could partner with Healthiest Ames. And I appreciate, Keith, that there's already been some thought of this. I wasn't aware of that. So there are some communities in central Iowa in the metro area that are already doing some development work that we can look to for examples. But I think that kind of attribute would be very welcome by the community.
Yeah, I think I would just be a little weary of putting anything specific in there. I mean, since we're doing long range planning, we just don't know what types of things, will come and go in terms of popularity. And I know even with the fitness equipment, we looked at that during the Miracle Park discussion, and times may have changed, but at the time, I know Keith and his staff had reported back that in other communities in Iowa where they had installed them, they were barely used. And so that's why one of the reasons why we ultimately did not move forward with having them as part of the Miracle Park discussion. And so I just think when we start calling out specific things in this document as opposed to a parks plan or a CIP, we might tie our hands a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Amber, because even you look at the Miracle Park in general, nowhere in our master plan or the land use policy plan did it say do an inclusive playground or a miracle field, or right now in our in the CIP with the accessible boat or canoe kayak access up at Ada Hayden. There's a lot of things that the specifics aren't there, but to your point, Tim, the community need, it comes forward, something rises to the top, and when we have like the Miracle Park with the fundraising opportunity and people really willing to go out there and do that, and the same thing with the canoe kayak access up at Ada Hayden, when those things come up, we look at them and say, hey, this is a great thing, and then we get after it. So I think you're right. There's a number of things we can put things in here as examples, but I think it is important that we have to be flexible enough that when something does present itself, that we can take that opportunity and go after it, like we have in a couple of situations recently.
Yep, good points.
Keith, you just mentioned if something comes forward and it rises to the top. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because of my involvement with the design studies course at Iowa State, is the way in which we may be able to incorporate those grassroots ideas for the variety of user needs dependent on different communities and different areas within the city. Is there a place for us to express that desire or that value for the neighborhood's wants and needs? This all sounds sort of top down. We're going to identify these and we're going to ensure that this happens, but we have a variety of users who might be able to identify what they need better than we can identify what they need.
Well, and that's a good point, Gloria. And I think if you look at some of the things that we just discussed, the inclusive playground and the Miracle Park, that started with a conversation at Bandshell during an Ames on the Half Shell event where an individual came up to me and said, hey, can we talk about this at some point? And now look, we're going to have a $2+ million facility. The canoe kayak access, started with somebody coming and saying, hey, you know what? We think that this is there's an opportunity, and we're willing to help do that. So those all came from a phone call. When we look at like Roosevelt Park, when we look at some of the things that happen at our neighborhood parks, a lot of that, that Roosevelt Park came because of the neighborhood didn't want the school district to sell that property, didn't want to go into development. They wanted to keep that green space. And then we work with them and get their ideas. And now we have, we have a shelter that's unique and different than anything else in the park system. We don't have any park shelter that's raised to be able to accommodate the concerts that they have. We have the ping pong tables, the outdoor ping pong tables that are there. So there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of things within the park system, either from a park development standpoint or either a program standpoint, that come because somebody made a phone call to us or sent us an email. And sometimes they may fester for a little while before they wind up, rising to the top. Might not be the right time when that phone call happens. But it may be something that comes up. So I think there's a lot of a lot of things that happen within the park system and with the programs that do come from those kind of grassroots from the bottom up saying, hey, have you ever thought about this?
Well, I appreciate that. And I think those are great examples of what's already happened. But what I don't see in those examples is those people who do not interact with the city, who don't maybe know you, or they're afraid of calling somebody, or they aren't part of a neighborhood organization like we have in Roosevelt. I mean, the Roosevelt neighborhood is really well established. They had the ability to mobilize to develop their parks. And I think that as we develop more outreach into our various communities, we are going to find that there may be things that people are very interested in that have never been mentioned to us, simply because the people of that particular community have not been interacting with the city. Maybe they don't trust us. Maybe they don't believe that what they say has any value, or that we're going to do anything with it. So I guess I'm looking for a place in this plan to incorporate some intentional valuing of the input from our neighborhoods, our different communities, in how we establish those plans. And I don't know where that belongs. Maybe it doesn't actually belong in these actions. It's just a thought.
Did you
Okay.
have some comments on that, Kelly?
But
I think we'd have to think about that and exactly how that would fit into this format versus something that's more of a department document or the master plan document. I think we'd have to think about that, Gloria, how that fits exactly.
okay, let's go ahead and move on to next page.
Just wanted to hit one last thing on here. One of these last bullets here says the Greenway map. One thing that we need to develop, or I think we need to develop to really reach the vision that's talked about here, is really this future trails map. Keith articulated a vision where how much continuous trails can we get into the city for some major opportunities for recreation that's not interrupted by roadways or other obstacles. I think to plan at that scale, we need to have a map that talks about that. It also would fit well when we start to talk about the external connections to county resources. So we will start to prepare a map to put in here eventually to help guide the big picture trail decisions and the resources that we need for those for the county connections as well. So to move to the last page here on park actions. Again, mostly the park system is going to be about recreation, but there will be times for environmental benefits. We don't want to lose track of those in these policies about parks. Environmental standards are in some places similar, but this is also a good place to house those when talking about parks. So number 6 is again trying to be a little more specific, that when we do develop areas, that we do expect some kind of conservation approach, that it's not just cut down the trees, flatten the land, and fill the wetlands, and I have a subdivision. We have a conservation subdivision ordinance. It can be applicable to multiple areas in the city. We also expect that the private open space is a good use of some of the land and developments. Developers are pretty used to having to work with private open space, so I don't think that's a difficult thing for them to accept going forward, since we've been doing this now for 20 years. The last one is really these partnerships. So we've talked about this a couple of times. We have a lot of land resources for the city, but this can also get augmented through partnerships. And it's not just the big entities of the county and the university. We have a lot of nonprofits. We have a lot of volunteer organizations that work with Parks and Rec department to accomplish things for us. That's great for us. The one thing that is a struggle at times is the relationship with the school districts, because we have a lot of competing time needs. And it's great for us when that works as a city. I think what we're cautioning is you shouldn't rely upon that as your main resource for active recreation. And I say that because we have a lot of neighborhoods in the Ames school district, but most of our new neighborhoods are not going to be in the Ames school district. And we have no guarantee of schools being in these neighborhoods. So it really pushes that forward, that the park space is going to be really critical in the new neighborhoods, because you don't have the fallback of a neighborhood school probably to act as that playground resource or that large field for kicking a soccer ball. So when we can, we definitely want to work with the school districts to use those resources, but we shouldn't count on it in all of our growth rates. Is there any other comments on these three?
I'd like to add one other topic I didn't see represented here. I might have missed it, but it's one of these overlaps between the park interest and the environmental part of this conversation. This is just the first time I think makes sense to discuss, and that is the issue of night sky protection and ensuring that we are aware of and try to limit unnecessarily light pollution at night. So I'd suggest that's something that's sort of at the right level of discussion for a document like this. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that didn't come to mind, but I think that does belong into the environmental section that we're going to get to, David.
Okay, good.
It is one of those resources that we should consider management. We do have zoning code standards for it.
Sure.
I think it lives in any way in the land use policy plan as a support for that.
Okay, but also here in point 5, where it mentions designing for environmental priorities, it could be listed there too. I'll leave it to you to decide where it's best to go. But I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
I have a question on the environmental side. The Tedesco Park is, I think, it's off to an extraordinary start. Do we want to think about park design for environmental education? So some of this is in more programming than it is in the design side. But I think that's in some ways been a good role model for some other things that we might do as we think about park development. So should we think about environmental learning as a potential bullet point in this area?
I think we could fit it in somewhere. I mean, I think that makes sense. And you have cultural things you can learn about. You can have environmental issues to learn about. I think there's definitely learning opportunities. We could reference that somewhere in here.
Okay, one more thing. I don't know where to put this. So if we want to think about the role of art, incorporating it into our park system, I think there are some really fun projects that are happening around the country. And I sent the council an example of a project in Council Bluffs where they're using a series of stands in a park called Sunset Park in Council Bluffs. And a children's book is placed, I don't know, every probably 15 feet. And so you would take your kids and you would go from stand to stand to stand. In the process, you're reading a children's book. So it's getting the kids reading, but it's also being done in the parks. And so I like the idea of art bleeding into different ways in which we have our community. And I didn't see a space for that in there, and I don't know that it has to have one, but maybe as we think about our Public Arts Commission, encourage them to think about ways in which to incorporate art, maybe to build partnerships with our library, just do creative things with the parks.
So Tim, how about in June, one of the things we're going to circle around to is community character and culture. Make sure we don't forget to talk about art. We'll definitely talk about art then, but maybe as part of a bigger art, we can talk about what as a forum for display of art, rather than just focus on parks right now. Is that if we bring that back up in June?
That's great. It's just as a placeholder somewhere.
Okay.
It might also relate to the user experience back in number 4, depending what kind of art you're talking about. You know, if it's interactive, like the pedestals that Tim was talking about, or the sculptures that they have out at Reliable Street, which are art pieces, but they're also climate. A lot of examples of that user experience artwork, doing this review for the design course at Iowa State this semester.
Okay. Ready to move on, Kelly?
Yep, I'm gonna, we looked at this slide already. This is again, the overall map. Is there any other questions about the mapping? We definitely will be adding maps to flesh out these details more clearly. Okay. So with environment, I'm gonna give it back to Corey to walk through the background and the principles again, and then I'll talk about the actions. So did we lose Corey? I might have to go back and see. Oh, he's there.
So just imagine that most of the users who are going to open up the comprehensive plan, they're not going to be necessarily going through the land use chapter or the parks chapter. They may just be looking at the environment system, and that's it. And so some of the things that you're going to be seeing as far as the principal statements and even some of the actions, there's going to seem like there's some citing of things that you may have heard before, but you just have to realize that if the user is opening up the document, there is going to be cross references to all these other different parts of the comprehensive plan, because again, it's a comprehensive plan. So all the stuff is braided together. The vision statement that we've drafted at this point, needing reaction to, is Ames will practice environmental stewardship to support a high quality natural environment. Then supporting that, we can come back to the vision statement and again, wordsmithing later down the line, and then going to some of the conditions and just giving you a background that this is some of the material that we've collected, we've exhibited at a number of events, but it will also be put into this document. But using all the third-party resources that are available to us in GIS and then mapping it. Same thing was in the 97 LUPP, using the most recent information, so including hydric soils, slopes and topography, vegetation. And there's just, these are all thumbnails because there's not a giant story that you can tell out of each one individual map. I suppose you could. And then if you go to the next one, looking at species richness, sandy soils and green infrastructure. So setting all the sources there. But if you took every single one of those maps and then overlaid it, it's going to look very similar to the LUPP map, where it's got some of those critical resources. And so this is a map that combines all of that. And so degree of some sort of sensitivity to the soil and conditions around it from an environmental perspective.
So I'm going to jump for 1 second. So what RDG has done is use essentially the modern technology and data sets through GIS to do all these different layers for us and to make it available that it's really disclosed very clearly, to be cleanly available to people to see what we know is out there. They'll still have to go to DNR to find out specifics, but you can at least see these composites in one place and not have to go spend a lot of time searching for details. This will replace the documentation that was done in the 90s to some degree. Well, actually to quite a bit of a degree. We did some, as the city, we did some natural resources studies called, the Norris study was the one that was referenced in the LUPP to look at these habitat issues previously. So again, we're following the kind of the same environmental perspective and patterns from the 97 plan, but RDG is using a modern technique of GIS to make this more publicly available through mapping. And then we'll be able to use this in the comp plan.
And that material was all used when we were developing the development concepts as well. It's kind of a fire hose of information on the previous stuff that we've already shared with you. The 4 items that we've tailored for this one is, first one, design for environmental priorities. The second being preserve a network of green spaces. The third, improve water quality. And the fourth, apply climate change conscious policies. And just for the user who's going to be looking at this, who maybe not have looked at all the other chapters, but realizing that We do have one that we have looked at as a group: ensure sustainable growth, and then stewardship of a variety of open space. Now, circling back to number one, my notes. A lot of the things that you've seen in the design for environmental priorities, we've already applied to the future land use map. And so you'll be able to see those exhibited in that map. And then when we looked at in some of those infill demonstrations, those also considered environmental priorities as well. So listed out there as far as habitat preservation, water quality, and floodplain protection. Preserve network of green spaces. This should sound pretty familiar after just coming off of everything that we did with parks and open spaces. But it's reciting some of the information that we had in that section. And just again, the parks and open space system is part of our overall environment system for the city. Improve water quality. This is a topic that came up often. And so our green networks mimics the natural system of rainwater management, thereby preventing flooding and improving water quality. And then 4, with some of the things that are happening concurrently, apply climate change conscious policies, complete a greenhouse gas inventory and climate action plan to assess strategies that may reduce Ames emissions related to climate change. Future change in the plan and policies may be necessary to realize this principle. And then, of course, the other one, from the other parts. So again, if you're picking up this document, you were not familiar with the land use chapter, which again has a considerable amount of information about the environment. And then also the same thing with parks and recreation, which has, I guess, a number of things on the environment. This one here tries to encapsulate into one chapter.
And I think we're going to suggest some of this language will get tweaked as we put it into the chapters themselves. But I think when Corey and I were looking at again this earlier today, I think we could highlight 2 things that we know we probably want to adjust tonight. When we were looking at number 2, the last little add-on here, and provide fertile land to grow food. As we started to look at that it didn't really have necessarily a strong place in the city. Maybe it's representative of the Ames Urban Fringe Plan area, but we can see how that could get misconstrued about being an urban condition when it's probably more about larger planting areas. So we would probably strike reference to food here as part of green space management. And then I think in the next one on water quality, we can't prevent flooding, so we're going to avoid the word, or not avoid, we're going to modify the word prevent and make it more about. You remember what we decided, Corey, this afternoon?
Yeah, it could be manage.
I think manage or reduce is probably the better term. It's not, preventing is probably overstating the ability to do that.
Managing floods might be a little overstating it too, but
Preventing's too strong of a word.
Can we go back to the vision statement for a second? Can you define what high quality natural environment is? That seems to be very subjective versus objective.
Yeah, I guess how I would describe high quality natural environment is that it's just well taken care for. I suppose subject interpretation.
Well, here's the point. This is going to be a document that's going to be viewed by a multiplicity of individuals that's going to have different priorities and it may mean different things to different people. And so I'm questioning, would it be beneficial to be more explicit, or somehow after following that vision statement that we somehow flesh out what that means in reality for future councils, for our council as well as future councils, and also people are picking us up and using it as a tool, because it seems pretty broad, and what high quality natural environment means to John and Corey and Kelly and Tim may be different to George, Harry, and Sally, for sake of discussion.
Mr. Mayor, Do you have like a specific example that you think would be a bad interpretation of that, one way or the other? Either it's too extremely high quality, or it's so poor it couldn't possibly be considered high quality, but it's in the eye of the beholder.
Well, high quality natural environment might be is that if there's, we're not going to do any building that would have any adverse effect on wetlands and streams, period. Or we're just not going to, I mean, taken to the nth degree, it could be, we're not going to actually build on take any farmland out of production, because high quality natural environment is we're leaving that what it is.
So I would caution anybody to take a vision statement and use that for administration. That would be the first thing. So I think where you want to, so if we don't have that wording right, I think the details don't belong in the vision statement. I think they belong in the principles, because that's supposed to be fleshing out the concept more. So if I was to take principle number 1 and say design for environmental priorities, what we're trying to say there is that development's going to occur, but we're going to protect the most sensitive areas, and those are prioritized as habitat, water quality, and floodplain. It doesn't say development's not going to occur, that we're going to do it in an environmentally friendly way and be sensitive to it. So if we need to work on the principle to make it more understood that this is a reaction to development, then we can do that. I'm not saying the vision statement's perfect, but I think it needs to be a clean, concise statement, and the details need to be in the principles.
Okay, that's helpful, Kelly. Maybe it's a matter of saying under your principles with your double slash, a high quality environment or a high quality natural environment includes, or you have a simple statement that precedes number 1, so it ties it in with the vision statement, and then it's just saying this is how we're going to accomplish it. I appreciate your explanation. It's a good point.
Yeah, and I think that the narrative of the chapter, Corey, would be able to set context for it.
Yep. I'm just gonna write it making sure that.
Because then that really helps everybody understand this is how we're going to accomplish that, and just ties it together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Another option, just for your consideration on this point, is if you think that the phrase "support a high quality natural environment" invites more questions than it answers, then you could just lose the phrase and sort of go even more high level and abstract. I'm not going to recommend, that I want this versus that, but if that's the cause of the problem, maybe it doesn't even have to be in the vision statement at all.
So David, you're saying division be Ames will practice environmental stewardship.
Period. Yeah, or something along the will practice thoughtful or appropriate, or I basically I agree with Kelly though that it's intended to be very high level, and there are many different acceptable forms of the vision statement, I think.
Yep. No. Point well taken. Any other comments or questions for Kelly or Corey on everything through the principles on the environment?
Well, one of the things that I don't see is any mention of how Ames fits in with the watersheds that we're part of, or part of working with the county. That broader perspective. It's almost like Ames is in a bubble and we're going to do what's good for Ames, but we've got people upstream from us and downstream from us, and we have a countywide watershed assessment that we're supposed to be fitting into somehow at some point. So I wonder where that component is.
That's just a good catch. That's embarrassing because that's something we think about.
Well, it's in actions, right? I mean, maybe it's not in principles.
Yeah, I thought we'd captured it in actions, but so in action number 2, we say watershed plans.
And also in action 1 has watershed protection as well.
Yeah, that's where I think we hit on it. We could weave that into something in the principles too.
So I had a question too. Two questions. One was I'm bummed you want to take out the part about fertile land to grow food. I don't know that it necessarily needs to go here, but it would be nice if it went here or in the parks section. That is of value in one of those two places. And the other thing that's kind of related is we talk about improving water quality, and I think should we address soil or air quality too? I mean, I get that water is very prominent in our minds with the river and creek, and I can see how that becomes focused, but I think soil quality is something that we can impact through compost through treatments either on the soil or how developments handle soil. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Is that we're drawing out water quality, but not soil or air. Is that on purpose, or maybe there's no room to change those? That's my question.
I guess Corey can add on to this after I say this. I mean, we did touch on air quality and the action. Since we're not a non-attainment for air, it didn't really rise to the forefront of my consciousness of thinking that was an issue that we really had to push on as a priority. I could be wrong. That was my opinion. And then what was the second part, Bronwyn? Soil quality, yeah. And that kind of relates back to the food thing, but and I guess that healthy soil would lead to better species strength too. Yeah.
Well, could you flesh this out a bit? I want to better understand your thoughts on this. So, what do you mean by soil quality?
Well, there are places where soil quality is poor, right? Because maybe there was a development there and the topsoil got stripped and it's not there anymore. Or maybe the soil type that's there is, I suppose it's all would have natural things that prefer it. But I think sometimes in places where humans have been, right, the soil quality has been degraded from compaction and things like that. And do we as the city have any responsibility to think about that or try to amend it over time?
Are you talking about in our park system?
Yeah, I guess on land that we could affect.
Okay.
So Broadway, I would say the way that's addressed in our codes is through the stormwater management ordinance. So it has a lot of details about when new development happens, about minimizing compaction, talking about organic content in soil. When we did our landscape code update a few years ago, we did add an organic soil percentage, organic content, I should say, percentage in soil. So we've addressed it a little bit through more precise code sections rather than a broader policy. I'm not sure where exactly what soil stewardship would be beyond what those code sections are that we have now.
Yeah, maybe those code sections would be sufficient. I just didn't know if it could maybe be added, or maybe you're not improving, but just sort of maintaining soil quality at that point. So maybe it doesn't need to be a principle, but it's already a goal if we're addressing it in code sections, which is good. That's a good thing. I just was curious why water quality was on here and the other was
not. And so you're interested in seeing something on the soil piece. When we assemble the draft, we'll get that in there too. That's part of the purpose. This is your document. It's the city's plan. So the purpose of the steering committee is to point out some gaps so we can address and add some more things. And
if it's already if we're already addressing it, then it shouldn't hurt to put it in as a principle or part of one somehow. I don't know. That's my thought. I think that's all I had on that one. This slide.
Okay. So I think we have 2 slides left.
If I may, one more small wordsmithing item, and that is on Principle 4 on the climate change. I just think this can be strengthened. I would like to see us, if we're stating a principle, have it be a little stronger than this. It reads right now, the climate action plan to assess strategies that may reduce Ames's emissions. I think really the intent is to try to reduce the emissions, not just that it could happen. So I'd suggest strengthening that. We could say, assess strategies to reduce emissions, something like that. And I'll just leave it with that comment. Does that make sense?
Assess strategies.
David, you made the motion on a few months ago regarding, the climate action plan.
Yeah.
And when I read this, the other day in preparation for the meeting, I failed to reach out to you and find out, is this consistent with the motion that council adopted? I think it is, but I'll make sure that this would be the place to put it in.
Yeah.
I think it does rephrase it in a pretty reasonable way. I like that it specifically recognizes that further changes to the plan may be necessary to realize the principle. I think it's it characterizes it fairly for this purpose in the document.
Thank you.
You're just asking David for a little
Clarify, David, one point of clarification. So I like what we're doing on the environmental piece, but how does our park plan then tie in to the climate action plan goals? Could you say one more word on that?
I don't know that it does. I think you should really think of the environmental piece as having significant overlap with parks and open space, but there are distinct components that are not about parks and open space. And the climate action plan itself may or may not have guided how it operates parks versus other citywide action measures. I don't know that it's going to tell us how to run a park necessarily.
Tim, I had the same question, and then I realized that really the principles on the agenda is parks, trails, and open spaces, and then the second one is actually environments. Environment is actually being characterized as a separate category. Is that correct, Kelly?
Yeah, we were trying to capture that distinctly.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
I just had one last question that I thought of, and it tied to David's earlier point about the night sky. And I was just glancing, are any of our principles, I'm looking here, if they list a value of unmodified area, and we talk about, I guess, the network of natural areas, parks, and open spaces. But the point about the night sky, would that go here too in the principles of environment that we, the Ames use an untouched element, not everywhere, obviously. Some of our parks are manicured, but that we put a value on spaces and elements of the environment like the night sky that are, unadulterated by human impact.
Yeah, I think it goes up to number one. It just, in that list of priorities included habitat preservation, dark skies, water quality, and floodplain protection.
Perfect. Good. Yeah, I just liked that point earlier. I want to make sure it did get fit in somewhere. So thank you.
All right, so moving into actions, our last two tonight. These are really set up to be a methodical kind of action approach. Number one is to really do studies and gather data. There's a lot of different things that we do at the city now that are recognized here, but these are also kind of general data gathering exercises that can address a lot of environmental issues. And number two is really focused then on, after you have data, to use it. That would be good, right? Let's collect the data, and then let's use plans and use models to make good decisions about managing the environmental issues that are studied. So we think what we're trying to do here is this isn't necessarily an exclusive list, but this to us hit the primary ones that are most likely to be of an issue to somebody and affect the land use patterns of the city or the development patterns of the city. Any questions on this? And this is where we started number 2 to try to bring into play these development regulations and ordinances that we do have. So it's not very explicit, but that is that tie-in that we're going to use ordinances to regulate some of these issues.
Kelly and Corey, one of the things that I don't see here again is that notion of working with the county or other partners. And that I think was a specific action item under the parks. And it seems to me that environment is also one of those partnership activities, especially when we've got the watershed as a county endeavor managing that. And we have the Tedesco Environmental Learning Corridor. Is it possible to add a component of partnering in as an action?
Of course, yeah. I mean, this is your document.
Well, it's our document. It's not mine. So
that needs to get in there. You bet. Makes a lot of sense. I don't see it in the principles either. Yep.
Yeah,
that's a get.
Maybe modify 2, maybe make it part of 3. I'm not sure where to put it, but I think we hear what you're saying.
well, it may be capturing the plans that are available elsewhere. I think the way you described number 1 and number 2 is us working on our own plans, but there are these other plans that are out there already, like the watershed assessment, which was done in 2018 countywide. So maybe that would be something to incorporate. So it's not just looking at the plans the city develops, but drawing on other plans from local partners that may already exist, whether that's Story County Conservation or the county itself, or maybe even the state has done something. We've got the state nursery here. Who knows what other plans are out there. So I could see how that could be part of 2 or 3.
We'll take a look at that.
Is this list of on the inventory of known environmental resources that you have here, like greenhouse gas inventory, watershed, that list would grow, I assume? That's not that's just examples of
it's not going to be exhaustive, but if there's some that would need to be added to it, happy to do it.
Well, it just ties back into like how, if say we were talking about the night sky again, some sort of measure of light or maybe a measure of sound, if that were also something, but that's, I don't know if there's a third party one of those.
It does, Corey, it does say on number 1, your last statement says the inventory may include, you could say may include, but this is not exhaustive or something like that. So that would basically indicate that we're trying to capture the big ones.
Yeah,
but the other ones may be woven in, like you're saying, because the night sky is already a part of our ordinance, isn't it?
Certain parts, yeah.
Yeah, it is. I guess I haven't heard of collecting light pollution data, so I'm not sure where that would take us if we were to say that specifically.
Yeah, I didn't know if there was a third party that did anything like that. So probably
I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah, there were others I was thinking of, but we don't need to list them all tonight. I think that's just that we can add to it later. Or
okay. So number 3 is to not just say development has to follow our standards, but to think about how it works with city actions and city projects as well. It's building upon the studies and the modeling to say that we will have strategies and we'll have them in plans that are important. The one that I want to highlight is most of these you've seen before. We talked about stormwater, streams, natural resource conservation, greenways. The floodplain one is something that isn't really described very much in the current LUPP, yet it's something that comes up very frequently at the council level and discussion, and we have a floodplain ordinance as well. So we definitely want to make sure that's included here. And as we've talked about things over time, we have a pretty strong set of regulations for the 100-year floodway fringe area, and that over time, maybe it does become appropriate to think about broader areas than that extend beyond the 100-year. I don't think we're ready tonight to say anything like that, but I think it's important to have it in there, something to consider as time passes for the community. The other ones here are trying to address a couple other miscellaneous issues. We're obviously an energy provider. We have Ames Electric in the city. We don't just use other energy resources from companies. So we do have the ability to support energy efficiency and alternative energy sources directly as a city. We want to include that, not just from a regulatory perspective, but think about what education could be, other things that help the city get away from fossil fuel reliance. And then number 5, we wanted to bring forward, it's a concept that's in the LUPP now. It kind of fits into our land use principle discussion as well. And we've talked about how the city wants to be wise with the use of its resources. We've talked before about not wanting to necessarily chase high water users. The current LUPP definitely wanted to focus on office park development over other types of industries. So here we're trying to reinforce the idea of low water usage is preferred. And this is from an economic development strategy perspective. Zoning doesn't necessarily restrict these things, but it's a combination of zoning and other strategies. And be aware that other industries might have pollution and that's just part of their operations, and whether that fits in the city or not is something that we have to evaluate and not necessarily just chase it because it's an economic development opportunity.
Kelly, so we've emphasized the kind of the negative here, non-polluting industries. Is there room to emphasize the positive as well? Those industries that are practicing sustainability or something like that as a value. So it's not just you aren't polluting, but you're also doing something that is economically and environmentally valuable.
It could.
I don't know that we want to. I mean, we haven't had that discussion, I guess. So
I think that would be a more detailed conversation if you want that to have meaning. To say that we support environmentally sustainable companies, we can say something like that. But if we're concerned about what it means, we would have to probably dig into that quite a bit. What does environmentally sustainable mean? I mean, that's a very far-reaching kind of statement. But I do understand what you're saying. It's definitely pitched in the negative here. Maybe there is a way to add a positive about what we prefer to see or what we'd like to see in the community as well.
Well, I suppose we could phrase it as companies that espouse the same values as the city shows in this plan.
Corey, can you think of any examples where RDG has had, in like an economic development chapter, talked about environmental stewardship and how that fits more precisely than what we here?
Yeah, I'm just drafting up some language right now to replace it once the document comes in front of you. So good comments. Yeah, thank you. A little bit more of a positive spin.
We can definitely look into some more ideas on that front also. And as Corey said, we can add them into the language. Is that something that council's interested in? Is talking about what we would like to see rather than just what we're unsure of seeing be proposed here?
Kelly, I'm looking at your next slide, which has the monthly topics, and you have that flower, I call it, with the plan. And one of the petals is economic development. Have we actually had a workshop on economic development? Because that might be a part of the topic or discussion on economic development, or is economic development, this is it, number 5 under actions and environment?
So the petals didn't align specifically with chapters necessarily.
Okay.
Like population and markets wasn't exactly a chapter. It was some background information to develop the scenarios. Same with infrastructure. So we've, some of them are topics, some of them are weaved into the land use or into the environmental. You're right, we didn't ever start out saying that we wanted an economic development chapter. It's something that could be thought of maybe in the context of a land use chapter. It could be, here's an environmental policy about it. I'm not sure that we were definitely, I know we weren't thinking we were writing an economic development chapter. Corey, what are some other ways that some of those kinds of thoughts could get weaved into the plan?
Yeah, some of it is like in those infill areas and growth areas. I mean, we talk a lot about economic development. I think to do that chapter, if we created a standalone chapter, there'd be some things like with the environment piece where we'd be borrowing from other sections of the plan. For example, number 5 on this. And then we probably need to do some follow-up with stakeholders just to get some more input on that particular topic. But yeah.
Thank you. I don't necessarily, I'm not suggesting you have to go ahead and add another chapter. I was just curious how that played into the overall conversation. And specifically the question you're asking council is what their preference was on Gloria's recommendation.
I think on the economic development, it was really a strong part of the initial phase of the project that we were being proactive in the scenarios about growth, that we were accommodating commercial growth, that we had the industrial plan embedded in the ideas. As Corey said, there's different infill opportunities. So we were really thinking of proactively planning for growth as supportive of economic development rather than saying economic development needed to have its own chapter and goals, because we wanted to really think of it as cohesive as part of a larger package of the community.
That's good. Thank you.
I had a comment that to me wasn't clearly addressed. I didn't know if like the way we take care of our parks, like the manicuring, the parks that we do take care of, if we could make that more environmentally friendly. I didn't know if that would go under environment or the parks topic, or if that was addressed at all.
I think park operations and maintenance is again probably something at best it's in the master plan level. It would not normally fit at the level we're talking about. I'm not even sure if the master plan now addresses maintenance strategies. Keith, is that something that's in there?
It is not. Now, we do things with it.
Yeah, I think there's a home for it though. I think it could probably be tied into number 2, principle number 2, and I know it's already cited in the parks piece, but if somebody were just picking up this environment section, they might not be able to pick up on that piece. Well, no, wait. I think the bullet at the very bottom of the principles said stewardship and variety of open space. There's some parts that we can add to that. Okay, yeah, that's good.
So what do you have in mind?
Different take on that. It's not just parks that has maintenance responsibilities. We do a lot of things with public works and with Parks and Rec where we're trying to be good stewards. I mean, for example, how we do snow removal and ice removal on streets. We could probably add something about city operations in general in an environmental chapter that kind of reinforces that that's our ethic. Again, we want to be good stewards of the environment. So reinforcing that in the actions would probably be a thing to do for the whole city.
I like that.
Kelly, over and above city operations, we also, I think, have Don't we have something now in our agreements with those people who rent land from us about the way they maintain that land and its ecologically and environmentally sensitive practices to ensure that we're protecting the watershed, et cetera?
I don't do leases, so I'm not familiar with that.
This is Steve. Yes, we do that with our farm managers, maintaining buffer strips and other practices such as that. Those are included in our leases with farmers.
So that could be part of that idea too, although that's not strictly speaking city operations, it's city properties and the way they're being maintained by our renters.
But maybe you expect it of all development, not just public entities, but also private developments too. The expectation. So those practices be incorporated in the private developments.
So yeah, I mean, stormwater ordinance, we address it partially. We don't really regulate like farming directly, so it's really good that we're doing that through leasing. Otherwise, the city wouldn't have an ordinance related to it. And plus,
I'm not talking about farming. I'm talking about maintaining property. How it's maintained, not only the public property, parks and rights of way, but maybe even private developments too, as a goal or expectation, as a policy.
That is the sort of thing that we could consider as a community value worth expressing here.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Okay, you ready to wrap up, Kelly, on tonight's workshop?
Yeah, I think we've gotten through everything. As we started out the meeting, you asked, what are we doing tonight? This is what we wanted to review with you. We think we've gotten some good input that we can work with forward. If the council is comfortable with this, then we'll move into starting to write the chapters, just like we have with the land use principles and the housing principles and the transportation principles.
Do you want a motion?
I don't know that we have in the past. I think it's more the last catch-all where there are other comments or suggestions, really, or really want to debate it again in the future. You should let us know and we can put on a future agenda.
All right, council, what's your comfort level? I'm going to proceed on the basis, if I don't hear anything, that everyone's comfortable with the way it is, and we're going to move on.
Yes.
Well, thank you for your time. We're moving forward. We're getting through the materials, and as you can see, June is. These aren't necessarily going to be 3 separate chapters here. We're trying to have the focus on these and how we're going to present that to you. We're still working on it. It doesn't mean we're going to have necessarily 3 chapters, but that's going to be some interesting discussion, I think, in June when we get that to you.
Mayor, I have a question.
Yes, David.
I did have a topic I wanted to discuss having to do with the draft plan. This relates to an email that we received this week, and I wonder, is this something that I should bring up now, or would you like to get council comments? Or
no, just go ahead and ask it now, David. That'd be fine.
Okay, yeah, since Kelly and Corey are still here. So I apologize if you haven't seen this email. I didn't send it to you myself, but it was from Jim Popkin, who pointed out some of the history behind why the previous LUPP map had an overlay for state land. So you can see both state designation and another intent for that land should it stop being state land. And basically the history had to do with council learning a lesson when something happened that they would prefer didn't unfold that way. And so they added the overlay in order to have a sense of what should happen if state land gets sold to a private property. What's the city's intent for that land? And so our current land use map in draft form doesn't have both of those things represented simultaneously everywhere. For example, there's just university designation for a lot of the land. So my question is this something that we should be considering going back to this sort of overlay format to deal with that contingency? Or do we need to talk about this at another meeting? What can you say about it?
I can talk about just some of the dialogue we've had with the university. It came to our understanding, things can change, obviously. But based on our takeaway, it's for the foreseeable future, not seeing that not becoming anything else but Iowa State University's managed property. And so with that, even so, when we were going into the design of the future land use map, being cognizant that there might be changes with that in the future, but for the horizon of the next 20 years, not saying that is something that would happen. But we totally recognize that leadership changes, decisions change, and that is a possibility. And at least with the current land use plan that we've got right now, it can be adapted to in that area. So,
David, I think it would be a good idea because, from my experience, you should never say never.
Yeah.
And you only pointed to Iowa State University, but in recent memory, the school district has sold off land. The Department of Transportation might be selling off land. Even the city of Ames could be. So it's more governmental use, not just focused on Iowa State University. But who knows, even with Iowa State University, what will happen in the next 5 years? There might be a whole different pressure to do something. So I think it was set up there so anybody who would purchase it would clearly know what to expect from the city council, and neighbors in the area would know what the council, and now understand a council could change, but at least the policy at that time, everybody would be aware, no surprises what probably would happen if you came before council and asked for a rezoning. You'd have to rezone it for governmental land. Well, I don't know what you're going to call it now, but the government use to some use. So I think it avoided a lot of trauma on the part of neighbors, potential buyers, and city council members. So I think it's a good exercise.
Steve, I think that probably in the case of these development areas we've identified, it makes sense because we're already looking at the state nursery as potential development area, and leaving Iowa State aside,
right,
that area is pretty significant to our
Absolutely.
interests.
That's what I'm saying. There's many other governmental entities involved in the city, including ourselves, and I think there's a lot of advantages of doing that. Where you place it or how it fits into your document, I don't know, but I think it's a policy statement that needs to be created by the council.
So, how do you suggest that we move forward on this?
I think you just would give us some time to talk to Corey and Kelly and see where it's appropriate.
I would love it if you did that.
I'm looking at the map on my wall right now. The way the current LUPP is written, what I would describe as core campus and then the athletics area, it has the university designation. But let's say the research area along Mortensen and State and Towers, those areas are shown as developable areas on the map. So really it was just core campus that was identified as university. And then the city and other areas show that if it was to develop, it's part of, a residential designation or something along those lines. That's how it's written now. I don't think the government overlay did exist. I think they took it off at one point and just made other designations.
Yeah, I'm confused because I'm looking at the 2015 map and I see the dots are the government land overlay.
And then in the fringe areas we did the same thing.
Yeah.
I definitely, what I think was the key part that Corey was talking about was we shouldn't rely on university land to meet a growth projection, which is different than what Mr. Popkin brought up is, well, what if this opportunity arose? How would we look at it? And I think you're right that we need to clean that up a little bit. And I think it probably should go on the land use map. And that's something that I can bring back to you as kind of the final draft of the land use map and show you how we could look at certain university areas probably being identified as university and others as potential.
Again, I would argue it's more than just the university areas.
Yeah, it's the one that shows up. I think that's the only one that showed up on the draft map that was its own designation. We didn't map the schools and other state properties separately. It was really the university that had its own designation in the draft map.
Yeah.
I could talk about it.
SBA.
Pardon me?
SGA zoning.
Yeah, but that's zoning. That's different.
But I think those were the properties that had the overlay. Anything that was SGA had
That's
an
right.
underlying base zone that,
Right. So that's what we need to talk
For
about. If it
future.
doesn't go in the land use policy plan, maybe it has to be another document that's adopted by the council as relates to zoning. We just need to talk about that.
But you're right, at least we have to have a policy acknowledging government-owned land because there's so much in the city and have something that's got to deal with it. So you're right, we need to put that in the land use chapter, at least as a discussion, and it may be a mapping exercise as well.
Yeah, it's going to be what I think it'll be. It'll be a redirection contingency. So we've already done those redirection areas, right? And so I think even within that map, it'll be, maybe we title that redirection contingency and we identify those areas separate from the redirection areas. As a thought.
The points are made, right? So I think Corey and Kelly, you guys and Steve can work through it. Appreciate you bringing that up, David, and or Mr. Pumpkin bringing it to our attention. And it sounds like it's going to be looked at and they integrate it in some way, or come back to the council and show us how you're going to propose to take it for that.
Right.
It makes sense to address it head on.
Anything else from council on the topics this evening that we talked about with Corey and Kelly? Hearing none, we will move on from the second item. There is no disposition of communication to council this evening, so we're going to move into council comments. And Tim, why don't we start with you tonight? Tim, you're muted.
Just a word of thanks. Our Parks and Rec program is outstanding. A community's expression of its values is often expressed in its park system, its values of its people, regardless of their economic status. Everyone enjoys our parks, and I think we have an outstanding parks program. And Keith's leadership has been instrumental at taking the next level. It's been very exciting tonight to envision where our parks will go in the future. I've also really appreciated seeing the development of friends groups around the parks. And so we've got some really instrumental things happening. And so it's a very exciting time for our parks in the community. That's all I have tonight. Thank you.
Rachel?
Nothing tonight, thanks.
All right. Amber?
Nothing for me.
Bronwyn?
Nothing for me tonight.
David?
Nothing for me.
Nicole?
I'd just like to touch on Gloria bringing up the inclusivity in our parks. I really appreciated that, and I know it's one of Iowa State's really big values, so that was really awesome.
Very good. And Gloria?
thank you, Nicole. And that's a good lead in for what I was going to bring up. And that is that Brian and I were engaged in an email exchange with one of my constituents who is very concerned about our meetings being as accessible as possible. And it turns out, I wasn't aware of this, but our Zoom phone number is not a toll-free number. And so that means anybody who doesn't have a national calling plan may be paying to access our Zoom meetings. And so I would like to move that we ask staff to come up with a plan that's going to make our meetings more accessible to those people who cannot afford to access Zoom that way. And also provide instructions for how to use Zoom somewhere on the city website so that those people who are nervous about engaging with us in this way may have an online resource to consult.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, Brown, 1 second. Any discussion?
So do we have, I guess, a couple things. This seems like more of a type of thing that the staff would ordinarily work on without council direction. Is there a sense in which there's a policy aspect here as opposed to this being more of a role for staff to work through.
Might be an extra cost there. I'm not sure. I think it's nominal and probably not going to be doing these meetings for many more months. So
I think it's more, from my perspective, it's important that we not be perceived as cutting anybody out of having the opportunity to participate. And since it did involve a fair amount of back and forth between Brian and my constituent, I got the impression that it might be good for us to provide some sort of direction on this and allow staff to determine what's going to be the best way to promote that kind of engagement. And the first meeting we had, we actually provided a local number and an email address for people to give input. So maybe that's the solution. Staff can tell us.
And implicit in your motion is they're just authorized or directed to go ahead and make
Yes.
the changes. They don't have to come back to council with anything else unless staff feels it's warranted. All right, any other questions? Everyone understand the motion? Those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carried. Anything else?
Nope, I think that's it.
All
And
right.
thank you, Corey and Kelly, for another interesting meeting.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just mention one item, and that is it's certainly disappointing that we can't have the Memorial Day celebration next Monday with the parade being canceled and the gathering to honor those that we normally honor on a Memorial Day event. And so I just want to recognize them and thank them for all they've done in service to our community. And I know, Tim, you've been involved with that, and it was a very hard decision to make to cancel it. And I don't know if you have any comments that you want to make in regards to that, because I think it's an important element of our community.
Particularly now, and thank you, John. Our country's never been more divided politically than it is now. And I think it's vital in our city council that we leave our partisan baggage at the door. We are all Americans. And these events, we're not Democrats, Republicans, we're all Americans, and things like Memorial Day. And there's a lot of planning that goes on to put the Memorial Day festivities together. And I want to just give a shout out to people who are watching and listening. Thanks to the people who've been planning basically for 6 months, putting this together. There will likely be some effort to do a live stream. The Legion will have a short presentation at the cemetery, but we really have wanted to keep people safe and not involve large crowds. So, keep your eye out for some kind of live streaming, probably around 11 o'clock on Monday. But John, your comments were perfect, and it's a great day to celebrate the fact that we're all Americans.
I know, I appreciate the fact that the Boy Scout troops go out there and they erect the flags in the in the cemetery, and there's a lot of flags they put up early in the day, and I think it's more or less just a good way to educate them on the sacrifices others have made to preserve and protect our freedom. So, okay, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move.
Is that Brown?
It was, yeah.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. We will see you. Have a nice weekend, and we will see you next Tuesday night.
Aye.
Good night.
Good night.